You wake up in 1347 with a splitting headache. Your tooth is rotting, your jaw is swelling, and the pain is so intense you can't think straight. So, what do? In this video, we're diving into the brutal, bizarre, and sometimes accidentally brilliant ways medieval people dealt with pain. Let's start with the stuff that actually worked, even if they didn't understand why. Willow bark was the medieval aspirin. The Egyptians discovered it around 1550 BC, and by the Middle Ages, it was standard treatment across Europe. You'd chew the bark or brew it into a bitter tea, and within an hour, your headache would ease, your fever would drop, your joint pain would become bearable. Why? Because willow bark contains salixin, which your body converts into salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin. Medieval people didn't know this, they just knew it worked. They'd been using it for thousands of years through pure trial and error. The problem was dosage. Too little, and you got no relief. Too much, and you'd end up vomiting, your stomach lining shredded by the acid. But when you're in agony, you take your chances. Then there was opium, extracted from poppy flowers. The Egyptians called it the plant of joy. The Greeks used it extensively. By medieval times, it was the go-to solution for severe pain, the kind that made you wish you were dead. Surgeons would soak a sponge in a mixture of opium, mandrake, hemlock, and wine, what they called a soporific sponge, and hold it over a patient's nose and mouth during amputations. The patient would inhale the fumes, slip into unconsciousness, and if they were lucky, they'd wake up after the surgery was over. If they weren't lucky, they'd inhale too much and stop breathing entirely. Dosing was a nightmare. Too little, and you'd wake up mid-surgery, screaming as they sawed through your leg. Too much, and you'd never wake up at all. Opium also came with a bonus feature: addiction. People who used it regularly for chronic pain would become dependent, their bodies craving more and more just to feel normal. Medieval doctors noticed this, but they had no framework to understand it. They just knew some people became slaves to the poppy, and there was nothing they could do about it. Alcohol was another weapon in the pain-fighting arsenal, and unlike opium, it was cheap and everywhere. Before a surgery, you'd drink as much strong ale or wine as you could stomach. The goal was simple: get so drunk you couldn't feel what was about to happen. Problem solved, right? Except alcohol is a terrible anesthetic. You're still conscious, you still feel pain, you're just too drunk to process it clearly or remember it later, assuming you survive. Surgeons preferred patients who were blackout drunk because they'd thrash less when the knife went in. But here's the thing: alcohol thins your blood. So while you're lying there in a stupor, you're also bleeding more than you would if you were sober. Many people bled to death on the operating table, not from the injury, but from the cure. Now let's talk about the truly insane methods. Bloodletting was the medieval medical establishment's favorite solution to almost everything, including pain. The logic went like this: pain is caused by too much blood pooling in one area of the body, creating pressure and imbalance. Solution: release the blood and restore balance. So the barber surgeon would take a lancet, a small sharp blade, and slice open a vein in your arm, your leg, sometimes even your forehead. They'd let you bleed into a bowl until you started to feel faint. How much blood depended on the practitioner. Some took a few ounces, others took pints. The theory was that removing bad blood would relieve the pressure causing your pain. In reality, all they were doing was making you weaker, paler, and more vulnerable to infection. But it was so ingrained in medical practice that even kings demanded it. King Charles II of England was bled 12 times in 4 days when he had a stroke. They drained over a quart of his blood. He died. Shocking. Leeches were the other bloodletting method, considered more refined. You'd place medicinal leeches on the painful area, say a swollen knee or an aching temple, and let them feast. Each leech could suck up to 10 times its body weight in blood. When they were full, they'd drop off, leaving you with a wound that bled for hours because leech saliva contains an anticoagulant. Did it help with pain? Sometimes, actually. Modern studies have shown that leech therapy can reduce inflammation and improve blood flow in certain conditions, like osteoarthritis. Medieval doctors stumbled onto something real, even if their reasoning was completely wrong. Cupping was another favorite. The practitioner would heat a glass cup using a flame, then quickly press it onto your skin. As the air inside cooled, it created a vacuum that sucked your skin up into the cup, pulling blood to the surface. The idea was the same as bloodletting: draw out the bad blood and relieve the pain. What it actually did was create painful bruises and sometimes blisters, but people swore by it. Why? Because the process was so painful that it distracted you from your original pain. Your brain could only process so much at once. Give it a new acute pain to focus on, and the chronic ache in your back suddenly feels less important. It's the medieval equivalent of hitting your thumb thumb with a hammer to forget about your headache. Then there was trepanation, drilling holes in the skull. If you had severe, persistent headaches, medieval surgeons believed it might be caused by pressure building up inside your head, evil spirits trapped in your skull, demons pressing on your brain. The solution? Drill a hole to let them out. They'd use a hand-cranked drill or a chisel and hammer, cutting through the bone while you were awake. Probably drunk, definitely screaming. Amazingly, some people survived this. We found medieval skulls with holes that show signs of healing, meaning the patient lived for years afterward. Did it relieve their headaches? Probably not, but the placebo effect is powerful, and if you believe the demons have been released, your brain might actually produce less pain signal. Here's where it gets interesting. Medieval people also used what we'd call psychological techniques, though they didn't have that language for it. Prayer was a massive part of pain management. If you were suffering, you'd pray to specific saints. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Blaise for throat pain, Saint Roch for plague sores. The act of prayer itself, the focused breathing, the repetitive words, the sense of connection to something larger than yourself, actually triggers the release of endorphins, your body's natural painkillers. Medieval people discovered meditation and mindfulness. They just called it devotion. Pilgrimages worked on the same principle. If your chronic pain wouldn't quit, you'd walk barefoot for days, sometimes weeks, to visit a shrine or holy relic. The physical act of walking, despite the pain, would strengthen your muscles and improve circulation. The sense of purpose and community with other pilgrims would boost your mental state. And when you finally arrived and knelt before the saint's bones or touched the holy water, your brain, flooded with hope and expectation, would release a cascade of neurochemicals that genuinely reduced your pain perception. It wasn't magic. It was the placebo effect weaponized through religious ritual, and it worked. Amulets and charms were everywhere. A piece of parchment with a prayer written on it, tied around your neck, a rabbit's foot in your pocket, a polished stone pressed against the painful area. Pure superstition, right? Except again, belief is powerful. If you genuinely believe that coral amulet is protecting you from evil spirits causing your joint pain, your stress levels drop. Lower stress means lower inflammation. Lower inflammation means less pain. Your brain is doing the heavy lifting, but the amulet gets the credit. Let me give you a modern comparison. When you take a painkiller today, say ibuprofen, about 30% of the pain relief you experience is placebo effect. You believe the pill will work, so your brain starts producing its own pain-blocking chemicals before the drug even hits your bloodstream. Medieval people understood this instinctively. They just attributed it to God or magic instead of neuroscience. But not everything was superstition. Some herbal remedies were legitimately effective. Turmeric, used in medieval Islamic medicine and later imported to Europe, contains curcumin, a compound we now know is a powerful anti-inflammatory. They'd mix it into food or drinks for joint pain and swelling. Corydalis, a plant used in Chinese medicine that medieval traders brought west, contains alkaloids that bind to the same receptors in your brain as prescription painkillers. People reported real relief without the knockout effects of opium. Cramp bark, used by Native Americans and adopted by European settlers, actually does relax smooth muscle tissue, making it effective for menstrual cramps and muscle spasms. The problem wasn't that medieval remedies didn't work. Many of them did. The problem was inconsistency. Herbal potency varies wildly depending on where the plant was grown, when it was harvested, how it was prepared. One batch of willow bark tea might relieve your headache. The next might do nothing. There was no quality control, no standardized dosing, no way to predict outcomes. You were gambling every time. And when the remedies failed, when the pain became unbearable, medieval people had one last option: endurance. They simply learned to live with it. Pain was seen as a spiritual test, a way to share in Christ's suffering on the cross. The more you endured, the more virtuous you were. Your agony on earth would be rewarded in heaven. This wasn't just religious propaganda. It was a coping mechanism, a way to find meaning in senseless suffering. If your pain served a higher purpose, it became bearable. Not pleasant, but bearable. So that's the setup. That's the world we're entering. A place where pain was constant, treatments were brutal, and the line between medicine and superstition was impossibly blurred. Over the next hour, we're going to walk through the specific methods medieval people used, from the surprisingly sophisticated to the absolutely horrifying. We'll see what worked, what didn't, and what's still being used today under different names. Because here's the truth. Modern medicine didn't appear out of nowhere. It grew directly from these crude, desperate experiments. Every scream, every failed treatment, every accidental discovery built the foundation for the painkillers sitting in your cabinet. right now. Let's start with the battlefield, where medieval pain management was tested under the worst possible conditions. When a knight took an arrow to the knee, literally, there was no time for careful diagnosis or gentle remedies. The battlefield was where medieval medicine either worked or you died screaming. And this is where we see the most aggressive, experimental approaches to pain, because soldiers had nothing to lose. Battlefield surgeons were brutal pragmatists. If you took an arrow, they'd yank it out immediately, splinters and all, because leaving it in meant certain infection. No anesthetic. You'd bite down on a leather strap while your fellow soldiers held you down. The pain was so intense that many men passed out, which the surgeons actually preferred because unconscious patients didn't thrash around. Once the arrow was out, they'd pour wine directly into the wound. Why wine? Because they'd noticed that wounds cleaned with wine were less likely to rot than wounds cleaned with water. They didn't know about bacteria or alcohol as a disinfectant. They just knew wine worked better. Empirical evidence through trial and error. If the wound was too deep, too ragged, they'd cauterize it. A red-hot iron pressed directly onto the open flesh, sealing the blood vessels and burning away what they hoped was infected tissue. The smell was horrific, burning meat and hair. The pain was beyond description. Men would scream until their voices gave out, then keep screaming silently, their faces contorted, their bodies convulsing. But it stopped the bleeding. And in a world without antibiotics, preventing blood loss was the difference between life and death. Amputations were common. If your leg was shattered by a mace or your arm was mangled beyond repair, the surgeon's solution was simple. Cut it off before gangrene sets in. They'd tie a tourniquet above the injury, a leather strap twisted tight with a stick. Then they'd use a bone saw, a brutal serrated blade designed to cut through living tissue as fast as possible. Speed was everything. The longer the surgery took, the more blood you lost, the more pain you endured, the more likely you'd die from shock. A skilled surgeon could remove a leg in under 2 minutes. They'd saw through the bone, peel back the skin to create a flap, then fold it over the stump and stitch it closed with needle and thread made from catgut. No sterile environment, no antibiotics. Just hope that your body would heal faster than the infection could spread. For pain management during these procedures, surgeons relied on the soporific sponge I mentioned earlier. They'd soak a sea sponge in a mixture of opium, mandrake root, hemlock, henbane, and wine, then let it dry. When surgery was needed, they'd rehydrate the sponge with warm water and hold it over the patient's face. The fumes would be inhaled, and within minutes, the patient would slip into a semi-conscious state, not fully asleep, but not fully aware either. It was unpredictable. Some patients went under completely. Others remained alert enough to feel every cut. The recipe varied wildly depending on who was making it, and there were no dosage guidelines. Just mix the ingredients, hope for the best, and pray the patient wakes up. Mandrake was particularly interesting. Medieval people believed the mandrake plant screamed when pulled from the ground, and that hearing the scream would drive you insane or kill you. So they'd tie a dog to the plant, then lure the dog away with food, letting the animal pull up the root and die in their place. Pure superstition, obviously. But mandrake does contain powerful alkaloids, tropane compounds that act as anticholinergics, blocking certain neurotransmitters in your brain. In the right dose, it causes sedation, hallucinations, and pain relief. In the wrong dose, it causes seizures, respiratory failure, and death. Medieval surgeons were playing with incredibly dangerous chemistry, and they didn't even know it. Hemlock, the plant that killed Socrates, was another ingredient. It contains conine, a neurotoxin that paralyzes your muscles starting from the legs and working up. In small doses, it creates numbness and a sensation of floating, perfect for dulling pain. In larger doses, it paralyzes your diaphragm and you suffocate, fully conscious but unable to breathe. The margin between therapeutic and lethal was razor thin, so when a medieval surgeon said he could put you to sleep for surgery, what he really meant was, I'm going to give you a cocktail of poisons that might knock you out, might make you hallucinate, might paralyze you, and might kill you. But it's better than feeling me saw through your leg bone while you're fully awake. And you know what? He was right. Here's something most people don't know. Medieval Islamic surgeons were far more advanced than their European counterparts. While European doctors were still bleeding patients and praying to saints, physicians in the Islamic Golden Age were developing actual surgical techniques. Al-Zahrawi, a 10th century Andalusian surgeon, wrote a medical encyclopedia that included over 200 surgical instruments he'd designed himself: scalpels, forceps, bone saws, specula. He pioneered the use of catgut for internal sutures, discovering that the body would absorb the stitches naturally, so they didn't need to be removed. He developed methods for treating skull fractures, removing bladder stones, and performing cesarean sections. options. For pain, Islamic physicians used a substance called Arabian anesthetic, a mixture of opium, hashish, and henbane seeds, ground into a powder and mixed with wine. Patients would drink it before surgery and fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. The dosing was more refined than anything happening in Europe at the time because Islamic scholars had access to Greek and Roman medical texts that had been lost in the West. They built on that knowledge instead of starting from scratch. But even with better techniques, surgery was still a last resort. The mortality rate was staggering. Infection killed more people than the original injury. Shock killed even more. Blood loss was often fatal, and pain, even with the best anesthetics available, surgery was still an ordeal of unimaginable agony. The soldiers who survived these procedures didn't just walk away. Many lived with chronic pain for the rest of their lives. Phantom limb pain, where an amputee still feels their missing arm or leg, was common and completely baffling to medieval doctors. How could you feel pain in a limb that wasn't there? They concluded it must be the soul's memory of the limb, a spiritual echo. We now know it's your brain's neural pathways misfiring, still sending signals to a body part that no longer exists. But without any way to retrain those pathways, medieval amputees just had to endure the sensation of their missing hand burning or their absent foot cramping. Battle trauma also caused what we'd now recognize as PTSD, but medieval people called it soldier's heart or shell shock, centuries before shells existed. Veterans would wake screaming from nightmares, flinch at sudden sounds, experience inexplicable pains that had no physical cause. Doctors couldn't treat it because they didn't understand it was psychological. They'd prescribe bloodletting or herbal sedatives, which did nothing, so soldiers suffered in silence, their invisible wounds as crippling as any physical injury. The battlefield taught medieval medicine one crucial lesson: the body can endure far more than you'd think possible. Men survived having limbs hacked off with axes. They survived arrows through the chest. They survived having their skulls cracked open, not because the treatment was good, but because human resilience is extraordinary. The body wants to live. It fights to heal, even when the odds are impossible. And that brings us to the next category of medieval pain management: the things people did to themselves because the alternative was worse. Imagine you're a peasant living miles from the nearest town. You have a tooth abscess, your jaw is swollen, your face is on fire, and the pain is so intense you can't sleep, can't eat, can't think. Going to a barber surgeon would cost money you don't have. So what do? You take matters into your own hands. Literally, tooth extraction at home was common. You'd tie a string around the loose or rotting tooth, attach the other end to a door or a tree branch, then yank, hard, fast. The pain was excruciating, but brief. If you were lucky, the tooth came out clean. If you weren't, it broke off at the root, leaving fragments embedded in your gum that would continue to rot and cause infection. Medieval people had terrible dental health because their diet was coarse and abrasive, and they had no way to prevent decay. By middle age, most people had lost several teeth. The gaps would make eating difficult, speaking difficult, but the alternative, living with constant toothache, was worse. For infections, people used poultices. You'd mash up herbs, garlic, bread mold, anything you thought might help. Mix it with fat or honey to make a paste, then pack it onto the wound and wrap it with cloth. Some of these worked. Honey is antibacterial. Bread mold sometimes contained early forms of penicillin. Garlic has antimicrobial properties, but most poultices just created a warm, moist environment where bacteria could thrive, turning a small cut into a life-threatening infection. Burns were treated with egg whites, butter, or rendered fat smeared over the injury. The logic was to seal the burn and keep air off it, reducing pain. In reality, these treatments could trap heat in the skin and make the burn worse. But people didn't know that. They just knew it felt soothing in the moment. For muscle pain and joint aches, people used heat. Hot stones wrapped in cloth and pressed against sore areas, sitting in front of the fire until your skin was nearly scalded. Crude hot water bottles made from animal bladders. Heat does genuinely help, increasing blood flow and relaxing tight muscles, so this was one home remedy that actually made sense. Cold compresses were used too, though less commonly because getting cold water in winter was easy, but in summer you'd need ice from a cold cellar or a deep well. Sprains and swellings were treated with cold cloths, which reduced inflammation. Again, accidentally correct. Massage was widespread, though not formalized. Your spouse or neighbor would knead your aching back with their hands, sometimes using oil, sometimes not. They had no knowledge of anatomy or pressure points, but the physical manipulation increased circulation and released muscle tension. It helped, crudely, but effectively. Then there were the truly strange remedies, the ones that came from folklore and desperation. For headaches, people would tie a live frog to their forehead, believing the frog would absorb the pain. For earaches, they'd pour warm oil or even urine into the ear canal. For joint pain, they'd rub themselves with animal fat, snake oil, or powdered gemstones mixed with wine. Did any of this work? Rarely. But the placebo effect was strong, and sometimes that was enough. If you believed the frog was drawing out your headache, your stress would decrease, your muscles would relax, and your headache might actually improve. Not because of the frog, but because your belief changed your physiology. One remedy that's particularly horrifying: using human fat as a pain treatment. There was a belief that fat from executed criminals had special healing properties. People would collect it after a hanging or beheading, render it down, and use it as a salve for arthritis or wounds. This was cannibalism adjacent, and it did absolutely nothing medically, but it was practiced across Europe for centuries. Another bizarre treatment: spider webs. If you cut yourself, you'd gather fresh spider webs and pack them into the wound. This actually worked, sort of. Spider silk contains proteins that promote blood clotting and have mild antimicrobial properties. Was it sterile? Absolutely not, but it helped stop bleeding faster than leaving the wound open. For chronic pain, especially the kind that came with old age, people often turned to alcohol, not as anesthesia, but as daily self-medication. A cup of wine in the morning to ease the ache in your joints. A mug of ale at midday to dull the back pain. By evening, you'd be drunk enough that everything hurt a little less. Functional alcoholism was rampant, but when the alternative was constant agony with no relief, it's not hard to see why people chose numbness. Women dealing with menstrual cramps had it particularly rough. The church taught that menstruation was a curse, punishment for Eve's sin, so complaining about the pain was seen as sinful. Women would use cramp bark or raspberry leaf tea, both of which genuinely help relax uterine muscles. They'd apply heat with warm stones pressed against the abdomen, but mostly they just endured because they had no choice. Childbirth pain was explained as divine punishment, suffering that women deserved because of original sin. Midwives would offer what comfort they could: herbal teas, massage, prayers, but they couldn't actually reduce the pain. The only real pain relief was for the baby to be born or the mother to die. 1 in 3 didn't make it. This is the reality that made medieval people so resilient. They had to be. Pain wasn't an emergency to be fixed immediately. It was a condition of existence. You lived with it until it killed you, or you learned to function despite it. There was no other option, and that philosophy carried over into their most extreme treatments, the ones that were supposed to prevent pain by preventing disease entirely. That's where things get really dark. Medieval medicine wasn't just about treating pain after it happened. It was about preventing it. Through regular, aggressive intervention, the human body was seen as a delicate system that needed constant maintenance, like a machine that would break down if you didn't perform routine upkeep. Except the maintenance involved deliberately making you sick. Purging was the cornerstone of preventive medicine. The theory was simple: your body accumulates bad humors, toxic substances, impurities. These build up over time and cause illness and pain, so you need to flush them out regularly. How? Through your bowels. People would drink powerful laxatives, herbal concoctions made from senna, aloe, or cascara bark that would trigger violent diarrhea. You'd spend hours on the privy, cramping and evacuating everything in your digestive system. The idea was that you were expelling the poisons that would otherwise cause future pain. Did it work? Not even a little. What it actually did was dehydrate you, strip your gut of beneficial bacteria, and weaken your overall health. But people believed in it so deeply that wealthy individuals would purge themselves monthly, sometimes weekly. They'd plan their social calendars around it. Sorry, can't attend the banquet. It's my purging day. Emetics were the other half of the equation. If purging cleared you out from below, vomiting cleared you out from above. You'd drink a mixture designed to make you violently ill. Ipecac root was popular. Then spend the next hour retching until your stomach was empty. The logic was the same. Expel the toxins before they cause problems. The result was the same. You just made yourself sick for no reason. These practices were so ingrained that they continued well into the 18th century. George Washington, first president of the United States, was bled, purged, and given emetics when he developed a throat infection in 1799. He died, almost certainly because the treatments weakened him past the point where his body could fight the infection. But his doctors believed they were helping. Bloodletting as prevention was even more common. Healthy people would have blood drawn regularly, believing it kept their humors balanced and prevented future illness. Spring was considered the best time for preventive bleeding because that's when blood was thought to be most active. You'd have a vein opened, lose a cup or or two of blood, then go home weak and pale, convinced you'd just done something healthy. For people with chronic pain, doctors would recommend bleeding from specific sites. Headache, bleed from the temples. Back pain, bleed from the lower spine. Joint pain, bleed near the affected joint. The goal was to relieve the local pressure causing the pain. It never worked, but people kept trying because the theory made sense to them. Here's the thing. Sometimes bloodletting actually did provide temporary relief. Not because it balanced humors, but because losing blood lowers your blood pressure. If you had a severe headache caused by hypertension, bleeding might actually reduce it. Of course, you'd also be anemic and exhausted, but your headache would be better. Medieval people noticed this correlation and concluded that bleeding cured headaches. They weren't entirely wrong, just wrong about why. Cupping and scarification were variations on the same theme. Instead of opening a major vein, the practitioner would make dozens of tiny cuts on your skin, then apply heated cups to draw blood out through the wounds. It was bleeding in slow motion, supposedly more refined and controlled. The result was the same: blood loss, weakness, and no actual medical benefit. But here's what's fascinating. Some of these preventive practices have modern equivalents. We still believe in regular detoxes and cleanses, even though there's no scientific evidence they do anything. We still think we need to purge our bodies of toxins, even though our liver and kidneys handle that automatically. The medieval instinct to actively maintain health through intervention never went away. We just repackaged it with better marketing. The darkest aspect of preventive medicine was how it was forced on people who couldn't consent. Children were bled and purged to keep them healthy. The elderly were subjected to aggressive treatments to stave off death. Mental illness was treated with bloodletting and purging because madness was seen as a buildup of bad humors in the brain. People suffered through these procedures not because they were sick, but because doctors believed prevention was better than cure. And this is where medieval pain management reveals its core philosophy. Pain was acceptable, even necessary, if it prevented worse pain later. Suffering through a purge today meant you wouldn't suffer from disease tomorrow. The agony of preventive bleeding meant you wouldn't experience the agony of unchecked illness. Pain was a tool, a sacrifice you made to maintain your health. This mindset extended to religious practices too. Flagellation, whipping yourself, or having others whip you, was seen as a way to purify your soul and prevent divine punishment. During the Black Death, groups of flagellants would walk from town to town, publicly beating themselves bloody, believing their suffering would appease God and stop the plague. It didn't, obviously, but the psychological need to do something, anything, in the face of overwhelming horror drove people to inflict pain on themselves. We judge these practices as barbaric now, but they made perfect sense within their worldview. If you genuinely believe that illness is caused by imbalanced humors, then bleeding, purging, and vomiting are logical solutions. If you genuinely believe that pain is a spiritual test, then embracing suffering is virtuous. Medieval people weren't stupid. They were working with the best information they had, and that information was catastrophically wrong. The real tragedy is how long it took to prove them wrong. Bloodletting remained standard practice until the mid-1800s. Purging was considered healthy into the early 1900s. The transition from humoral theory to germ theory took centuries, and during that entire time, people suffered through treatments that made them worse, not better. But not all medieval pain management was nonsense. Some of it was shockingly advanced, particularly when we look at the contributions from cultures outside of Europe. While European doctors were drilling holes in skulls and draining pints of blood, physicians in the Islamic world were developing actual medicine. This wasn't accidental. During the Islamic Golden Age, roughly 8th to 14th centuries, scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba had access to Greek and Roman medical texts that had been lost in Europe. They didn't just preserve this knowledge, they expanded it, conducting experiments, documenting results, and developing treatments that actually worked. Pain management in Islamic medicine was sophisticated. Physicians like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote extensive texts on pharmacology, cataloging hundreds of pain-relieving substances and their proper dosages. His canon of medicine became the standard medical textbook in Europe for over 500 years, and it's filled with practical, effective advice. For surgical pain, Islamic physicians developed better anesthetics than anything available in Europe. They'd combine opium with alcohol and inhale the vapors before surgery, achieving a level of sedation that was reliable and relatively safe. They understood that different procedures required different levels of pain control and adjusted their formulas accordingly. For chronic pain, they used a combination of herbal medicine and physical therapy. Massage was formalized into a medical practice. Baths and hydrotherapy were prescribed for muscle and joint pain. They understood that heat, cold, and movement could all be therapeutic when used correctly. Islamic surgeons also developed better surgical instruments and techniques, which meant less trauma, less bleeding, and less post-operative pain. They used cauterization carefully, not as a blunt instrument, but as a precise tool to seal specific blood vessels. They understood anatomy far better than European doctors because they studied it systematically. Traditional Chinese medicine took a completely different approach to pain, but it was equally sophisticated. The concept of Qi, or life energy, flowing through meridians in the body, gave Chinese physicians a framework for understanding pain as blockage or imbalance. Acupuncture, inserting fine needles into specific points to restore flow, has been practiced for over 2,000 years. Does acupuncture work? Modern science says yes, sort of. Multiple studies have shown that acupuncture can provide real pain relief for chronic conditions like back pain, osteoarthritis, and migraines. The mechanism isn't Qi flow, it's neurological. The needles stimulate nerves that trigger the release of endorphins and other pain-modulating chemicals in your brain and spinal cord. It's a real effect with a different explanation than the original theory. Chinese herbal medicine also produced effective pain remedies. Corydalis, which I mentioned earlier, contains dihydrocorybulbine, or DHCB, an alkaloid that binds to dopamine receptors and reduces pain signals. It's been used for centuries in China and is now being studied as a potential non-addictive pain medication. Turmeric, a staple of both Chinese and Indian Ayurvedic medicine, contains curcumin, which we now know is a powerful anti-inflammatory. Medieval traders brought turmeric to Europe, where it was adopted for treating joint pain and digestive issues. It worked then, it works now, for the same biochemical reasons. What's striking is how these non-European medical traditions emphasized holistic treatment. They didn't just address the symptom, they looked at the whole person: diet, lifestyle, mental state, environment. This made their pain management more effective because they understood that pain isn't just physical. European medicine eventually caught up, but it took the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the development of modern chemistry. By the time European doctors stopped bleeding patients, Islamic and Chinese physicians had been practicing evidence-based medicine for centuries, and some of those treatments are still in use today, just rebranded. Acupuncture is now offered in Western hospitals. Turmeric supplements line pharmacy shelves. Massage therapy is a recognized medical practice. The medieval world wasn't entirely barbaric. You just had to be in the right part of it. But for most people in medieval Europe, pain relief meant one thing: prayer. And that brings us to the final, most pervasive form of medieval pain management. The one that cost nothing, was available to everyone, and genuinely provided comfort, even if it didn't provide cure. In a world without effective medicine, the Church became the primary source of pain relief, not through medical intervention, but through spiritual comfort. And here's the thing, it actually helped. Not because prayer healed broken bones or cured infections, but because belief itself is a powerful painkiller. Medieval people practiced what we'd now call mindfulness through prayer. The repetitive nature of saying the rosary or chanting psalms created a meditative state that genuinely altered brain activity. Modern neuroscience shows that meditation reduces activity in the brain's pain centers. Medieval monks were practicing pain management through neuroplasticity. They just called it devotion. Fasting was another religious practice that affected pain. During Lent or other holy periods, people would eat very little, believing it purified their souls. Fasting actually triggers the release of ketones, which have anti-inflammatory properties. So medieval Christians who fasted for spiritual reasons accidentally discovered that dietary restriction could reduce chronic pain. When medicine failed, when home remedies didn't work, when the pain became unbearable, they turned to God. They prayed, they lit candles, they made offerings, they promised to live better lives if only the pain would stop. And sometimes, through the power of belief and the body's incredible capacity for self-healing, it did stop. Not always, not often enough, but sometimes, and that was enough to keep the faith alive. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.